Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay, President of the Board of Directors of the City Club. It is well known that America is a nation of immigrants. This has been fundamental to our greatness as a nation. The Statue of Liberty stands as a beacon, summoning people yearning to breathe free, people fleeing persecution, oppression, seeking a better life, and freedom to realize the American dream. It is much less well known that within our country, from World War I to 1970, more than 6 million African Americans yearning to breathe free as immigrants within their own country left one America, the Jim Crow South, for another America, the America of the North, the Midwest, the West. They took a leap of faith that they might experience a new birth of freedom under the warmth of other suns. The title of the award-winning book by today's speaker, Isabel Wilkerson. This massive demographic shift became known as the Great Migration, which transformed our country's literature, arts, politics, our country itself. And the Great Migration certainly transformed cities like Cleveland. For many African Americans, Cleveland itself was a beacon and the promised land, as you will hear. And as a point of pride, we here can note that the City Club was welcoming African Americans from our founding in 1912. After decades of research and legwork, Isabel Wilkerson has masterfully captured the epic story of America's Great Migration. In the past year, her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, has won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, as well as the Mark Linton History Prize. It was also named to the New York Times 10 Best Books for 2010 and has received numerous other awards. And in a ceremony here last night in Cleveland, Ms. Wilkerson's book was awarded the prestigious Anisfield Wolf Award, administered through the Cleveland Foundation. This is the preeminent American book prize for works focusing on issues of racism and diversity. Ms. Wilkerson was born and raised in Washington, D.C., where her parents settled after journeying from Georgia and Virginia during the Great Migration. She attended Howard University, then moved on to a prolific and distinguished career in journalism. As Chicago bureau chief for the New York Times, Ms. Wilkerson won the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, becoming the first African-American woman to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize in journalism, and the first African-American to win a Pulitzer Prize for individual reporting. She has also won the George S. Polk Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship. Ms. Wilkerson has served as Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton University and James M. Cox Professor at Emory University, and she's a professor in the School of Communications at Boston University. We pray for the lady visitor and the book she's trying to put together, said the spiritual leader of the Monroe, Louisiana Club of Los Angeles at a meeting that Isabel Wilkerson attended in 1996. Those prayers have been answered, and Ms. Wilkerson has put together a remarkable book. Please welcome to the City Club, Isabel Wilkerson.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and the reminder of that meeting that I attended so long ago, in which they were, in fact, praying for me. And I feel as if they're with me always as I've gone around the country talking about this book and this beautiful period, in some ways, of our history in which people took matters into their own hands and chose not to remain captive to a caste system that had held them within its grip for far too long. This book actually is celebrating its first year. It's a year old, and it was, believe it or not, thank you. Believe it or not, it was a year to the day that I was here in Cleveland at the initial launch of this book. And the book, I don't see a new one, but it did look new one day at the beginning, and now this is what it looks like. Look at this. This is what a year of going on the road talking about this can do for such an experience such as this. But it's lovely, and thank you so much for the warm welcome back to Cleveland. I've been to Cleveland several times. I think some of you in the audience have perhaps heard me. I was at Cuyahoga County Library back in February, after which I happened to have fallen into the freak snowstorm that hit, and I ended up spending more time at Hopkins, actually three days after that blizzard, and I still came back to Cleveland. It's a pleasure. But speaking of this, of why I'm here, though, this is one of the great beacons, one of the beautiful magnets, one of the receiving stations of this Great Migration. The Great Migration is truly one of the biggest underreported stories of the 20th century. It has been everywhere and yet under the radar screen. The vast, vast majority of African Americans that you ever meet in the North, the Midwest, and West are descended from people who did what was in this book. And beyond that, the stories of the people in this book, I mean, the book is called The Warmth of Other Suns, and its subtitle is The Epic Story of America's Great Migration. But in some ways, it's so much bigger than that, because the people in this book, 6 million people were part of this Great Migration over the course of those decades. 6 million. At the beginning of the migration, there were 90% of all African Americans who were living in the South. By the time it was over, half were living all over the rest of the country. So it was a massive redistribution of an entire population. But at the same time, what they did was in so many ways so similar to the experiences of almost every other American. All of us in some ways owe a debt to someone who had to come a long, long way in order for us to be here in this place at this time on this soil in the way that we are. We all owe a debt to people who may have crossed the Atlantic in steerage, or crossed the Rio Grande, or crossed the Pacific Ocean, or had come from Alabama across the Ohio River, that symbolic waterway, to get to freedom. And so in some ways this is a universal story of longing and determination and fortitude and courage that in some ways runs through the veins of all of us. And so in some ways the people in the book are proxies for all of us. I mean, how many of us know or are descended from someone, a great-grandmother who might have come from Ireland and settled in Cleveland or Chicago or in Detroit or someplace here in the United States, and then met a great-grandfather from Italy or from Russia or from Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and even from Ireland often, but would never have met otherwise. In other words, people migrating in some ways are what create whole new lineages, whole new streams, which mean that this is how we come to exist. I'm one of these people who, very much like many of you in the audience, if you think about your lineage, how many of you might not even exist had there not been for someone who came from a long way away and met someone that they might never, ever have met otherwise because of the great leap of faith that's required to make such a migration. Now, this migration that I've talked about, that I've written about, and that has taken up 15 years of my life, and I'm glad I didn't know when I set out to do the book, because if I'd known, I probably would not have completed it. So it's better that I didn't know, but I don't regret it at all. I had the chance while working on this book to interview over 1,200 people, and I interviewed those people in order to narrow it down to 3 amazing people who would represent the 6 million. And the 6 million people who were participants in this migration, they were in some ways defecting a caste system which had held them in its grip, held them in their grip for most of the 20th century, not that long ago. It was so extreme, the caste system in the South, which we know as Jim Crow, that it actually was against the law in Birmingham for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together. In parts of the South, particularly I discovered this in North Carolina, there was actually a black Bible and a white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in courtrooms. And I became aware of that by going through newspaper records and discovering an article that talked about that. It was talking about how a courtroom trial had been disrupted. And it had been disrupted because they could not find the Black Bible for the person who'd just taken the stand to swear to tell the truth on. They couldn't find it, and therefore they had to disrupt the trial, and the sheriff and the bailiff all had to go searching for this Bible. And we're talking about the very sacred text upon which the foundation of many people's belief systems and faith are founded, and yet they could not touch the same Bible. I've been asked since then, well, were they different Bibles? Like, was one maybe the American Standard for the black people and the King James for the white people? And it turned out that it was actually the same Bible, the same version of the Bible. They could not touch the same sacred object, the same sacred text. And so this was the world that these people that I'm describing in this book, these 6 million people, were ultimately leaving. And they ended up leaving because ultimately they were seeking political asylum within the borders of their own country. This is the only time that people, Americans, had to leave the place of their birth for a place far away within the borders of their own country to be recognized as the citizens to which they had been born. And that's what makes this a watershed and pivotal moment in our history. Now, the reasons why this happened are obviously quite complex, but ultimately the reason for this caste system was because the South was dependent upon not just a supply of labor, but an oversupply of labor, because this was an agricultural land in which the things that the South was growing, the crops that were being grown in the South, were ones that were extremely labor intensive. They needed not just enough hands on deck; they needed more than enough hands on deck, and those hands would have to be fallow for much of the year. They needed more people than one might imagine in order to plant and to chop and to tend, and then ultimately the biggest job of all, to harvest the cotton and the sugarcane and the tobacco and the rice that were the lifeblood of the South. And so they needed to have an oversupply, and they needed to make sure that these people did not have options to leave, and they did not make it easy for people to leave. These people were in some ways stuck and could not get out until opportunity arose during World War I. And it was during World War I that the North had a problem. The North had a problem because during World War I, immigration from Europe had come to a virtual halt, and many Europeans who were here in this country and who were the ones who were working the foundries and the steel mills and the factories and the foundries, they had to return home to help fight the war effort. And so that left this great shortage of labor in the North. And so the North began searching out the cheapest labor in the land, and it turned out that the cheapest labor in the land were African Americans in the South. And so they began to go and recruit heavily in the isolated precincts and countryside of the South, and began to recruit people to work the foundries and the factories and the steel mills and the railroads. That means that the majority of African Americans that you meet in the North and West, those earliest ones came at the express invitation of the North, the express invitation of the North, and they answered the call. However, when the South got wind of this poaching of their cheap labor, they did not take kindly to that, and they did everything they could to keep the people from leaving. They actually would arrest the people from the railroad platforms if they were on a platform that was heading north. They would arrest them from the train seats, so that people who had been saving all that time for that ticket to get north had to, instead of giving the ticket over to the conductor, would be arrested by the sheriff on a trumped-up charge of vagrancy, meaning they were not working. And the truth is, they weren't working because they were on a train seat trying to get out. So that charge was oddly enough true, but bizarre at the same time. They also would, when there were too many people to arrest, they would wave the train on through, so that people who'd been waiting all that time had to watch that train to freedom pass them by and have to figure out another way that they were going to get out. Now, this migration ended up, obviously changing the country as we know it. It ended up changing American culture as we know it. There are so many people who are descended from this migration who changed literature, the arts, sports, and politics. Many of the states and the places that the people went ultimately became, at that time they weren't thought of them as blue or red, but they often went to places and helped make them blue, you might say, just by their arrival. But, you know, I want to focus in on, and I know that we want to make sure that there are plenty of time for questions, I want to focus in on what is the immigrant heart and psyche that is the reason why so many of us are here at this time, in this place, at this moment, and how we came to be, often descendants of people who were part of this. It runs through all of our backgrounds. And one of the reasons is because when people leave, they don't do it for themselves, they do it for their children. They often are doing it for their children and their grandchildren and their unseen grandchildren. That's because, great-grandchildren. And that's because if you were raised up, or you raised or happen to be consigned to a particular place as a young person, as a child, and you had to suffer malnutrition or the lack of food, if you had to suffer from education that was not what it should have been, if you had to suffer other forms of oppression, wherever they might have been, sometimes it might be too late for you, but it's not too late for the children and the grandchildren and the unseen great-grandchildren. And so I want to tell you about one person who, a family that decided to come to Cleveland. One thing about this migration is this migration was not a haphazard unfurling of lost souls. Every migration is a referendum on the place that the people are leaving and is a wish and a dream and a prayer that things might be better where they're going to. And this is universal for anyone who ever leaves the only place they've ever known for a place that they've never seen in hopes that life might be better. And so when these people leave, they often are they're very focused on what they're going to do to try to make it, because there is no safety net. If you're an immigrant or a migrant, as these people were, failure is not an option. Failure is not an option because there is no backup for you. And often people are coming from very poor places where the people back home could not help. And so when they left on very specific routes. There is a reason why the majority of African Americans who live in Ohio are from Alabama. There's a reason. And that's because the migration streams, there were 3 migration streams. And it's a beautiful thing. There was a stream that went up the East Coast so that people were leaving Florida and Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia for Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and further north. That was one stream. That's my family stream. There was the Midwest stream, which carried people from primarily Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, and the entire Midwest. And then there was a third stream, which carried people from Texas and Louisiana to Los Angeles to Oakland and the entire West Coast. And that is the way that it is. If you were to go to any of these cities that I've described to you in the receiving stations, as they were called at the time by Carl Sandburg, who wrote about this migration, believe it or not, when they went, if you were to go to these places, you almost could tell where their people are from based on the city that they happen to be in at the time. And so I have noted, and I think all of us would agree, that we have are familiar with the fact that there are many people whose roots are in Alabama, but they are living here as Clevelanders, and many longtime Clevelanders, because that is the way the migration unfurled as the people were planning. Now I want to talk about one family that was leaving, just to give you a sense of what it was like for the people. This is a family that headed to Cleveland. It was the 1920s. And there was a husband and wife. They were sharecroppers in a place called Oakville, Alabama, which is in North Alabama. And the parents, these 2 parents, had a large family of 9 children, and they had debated for months as to whether they should leave. It was the mother who was anxious to go. The father was not so sure. So they went. Right. Now, as they were preparing to leave, to show you how much fear and stress there was in this experience, the little boy, he was about 9 years old, he happened to actually, as they were beginning to pack, he bumped into his father as they were moving around, rushing around their cabin, trying to get everything together. A lot of times you didn't tell people you were leaving when you left in those circumstances. It was dangerous to tell the planter that you had designs on leaving the South. So the father was quite nervous. And as the son bumped into the father as they were packing for the train, the father ended up putting both of his hands on his son's shoulders to steady himself, and then he quickly removed them out of a sense of embarrassment that he had betrayed his own fear to his youngest son. And only then did the boy realize how serious the situation was, because he said his father's hands and his eyes were shaking with fright. Now, they finally got the courage, or, obviously the mother was in charge, and so they ended up coming to Cleveland. They had always dreamed of Cleveland. They so dreamed of Cleveland that they actually named this boy, the 9-year-old, after Cleveland. His name was James Cleveland. They gave their son Cleveland as a middle name. They had never seen Cleveland. They'd heard about Cleveland, dreamt of Cleveland, but had never seen it for themselves. Never been outside of Alabama. But they named their son that just the same. On his first day of school in Cleveland, here in the North, he was assigned to a grade that was lower than the one that he'd been in Alabama, and the teacher couldn't understand his Southern accent. She asked him what his name was, and he said it was J.C. The teacher misheard him, and from that day forward, he was called Jesse. From that moment forward, everyone in the world would know him as Jesse. His last name was Owens. And that is how Jesse Owens got his name. And thank goodness his mother really was running that family. Now, we all know what happened later. He ended up setting records at the 1936 Olympics. He was the first American in the history of track and field to win as many gold medals, 4, in a single Olympics. And he disproved the Aryan notions of superiority that his Nazi hosts had believed. And, of course, many people are angered even to this day about how he was treated. But his father, the very one who had been a little nervous about all of this business of leaving and going to the North, did not see it that way. He actually was overcome with the magnitude of what had happened with his son and how far he had actually come, how far the entire family had come. He was overcome with the magnitude of the moment. And he realized that his son had had the chance to go to good schools, to run on real tracks, and to be coached at the Ohio State University rather than spend his life picking cotton. And so this is what his father said. His father said, "My son's victories in Germany forced me to realize that I made the best move of my life by moving out of the South." So he had come around. His wife was right. I want to just, close with the idea that one of the great things about any migration, and this one is the one I'm most familiar with, is that any migration is ultimately a decision by an individual that multiplied by millions can actually, in this case, is an example, change a country, actually change a country. The civil rights movement would have happened eventually, but it certainly was hastened by the fact that the South hemorrhaged a good portion of its labor, which it needed badly. It also forced the North to pay attention to a circumstance that had been ignored for far too long. Because as we know in American politics and American history and the ways of the world ultimately, a country will only get involved in the affairs of another country generally if they have a stake in what's going on in that other country. So that conflicts around the world often don't get intervention by the United States, for example, unless or until there's a need to do so. And usually that need arises because there's a large constituency here in the country, in this country, that helps put pressure just by their existence. Just the fact that they're here, they can vote, Their very presence puts pressure on the United States to act, as we saw, for example, in Northern Ireland and other parts of the world. And so by their very existence, a large percentage of African Americans being in the North in some ways forced the North to act. And in this way, it forced the media to pay attention to resistance that had been going on for really centuries, but particularly the kind of resistance that was occurring in the South from the 1940s and 50s as people were beginning to chafe and make efforts to protest a system that had been holding them in its grip. And so the fact that the people were here in the North meant that the cameras in the North began to take notice, and the cameras went down to the South and captured what had been resistance that had been going all along, but had been like a tree falling and no one could hear it. Now everyone could hear it. And that attention helped to propel and force the South to change. And that's what can be the result of a single individual's decision. It's as if the people had some internal mechanism that said now is the time to go. There was no leader for this migration. It was a leaderless movement. There was no one who sounded the time or the hour or the day that the people should go, which is what happens in any migration. It's individual families, individuals making a decision. It shows you the power of the individual. It's as if the people were saying, here in our homeland, in our ancestral homeland, our work is devalued and our very lives are devalued. Perhaps there are too many of us in one place. Perhaps we will fare better elsewhere if we spread out across this land, and that is ultimately what they did. I want to leave you with this, the thought of this moment. I hope that we can all conjure up and reflect upon and have perhaps a sense of the magnitude of a particular moment that had to have occurred in all of our backgrounds just for us to be here at this time, in this place, on this soil. And that is the moment of departure. Migration, whether across the ocean or across a river, is generally a young person's thing. So that moment of departure would have involved in all of our backgrounds an individual who was a young person standing at a railroad platform or standing at the dock about to board a boat that would take them far away. And at that, seeing them off on that particular day would have been their loved ones, the people who had raised them. It might have been a mother, a father, a grandparent, an aunt, a sibling, a cousin, a loved one, or a series of loved ones there. The people who were going to be staying could not make that crossing with this individual. That person was going to be setting out for a place far away. And at that moment of departure, there was no guarantee. Remember, we're going back many, many decades, perhaps centuries, depending upon how long your family's been here. There was no way for that young person to know when they might see this older person again. And the older person who could not make the crossing had no idea, could not know, and perhaps might fear that they might never see this person that they raised ever again. Remember, there was no Skype, no email, no cell phones. And that meant that it was a break of a nature that we almost can't even comprehend now. The next time that young person might hear about this older person who had raised them might be a telegram saying that your father has passed away, or that your mother is very ill, and if you are to see her alive, you better come home quickly. And so that's the magnitude of the sacrifice that had to have occurred for all of us to be here. And I think that they've left us a message, a course of action. In some ways, they've left us the answers to a lot of things that might vex us even today. These are people who often had absolutely nothing, and they left us the answers to many of the questions of the day that we might have in our own lives. And that is, what is it that we are to do? What is the course that we should take? Who are we? What are we at our core? And how can we tap into the power of who we are inside in order to be our best selves now? These people made the decision of their lives, and they ultimately made a great sacrifice so that we could be where we are. And that says to me, as one of the people who would not have existed had this migration not occurred, that we owe it to them to be our best selves. And given the fact that they did all that they did, change this country, with absolutely nothing, then that means that there's absolutely nothing that we, their heirs, cannot do. Thank you so much, Cleveland. Thank you for having me.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a Friday forum featuring Isabel Wilkerson. We will return to our speaker in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions now. Please remember to keep them brief. In 2012, the City Club of Cleveland will turn 100 years old. We're planning a number of events and will be actively soliciting support through our campaign for a new century. Our celebration will begin on October 10th of this year with a national conference on free speech at the Allen Theater. To learn more about the 100th anniversary events, visit the City Club website, www.cityclub.org/100. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across our country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS IdeaStream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler and the Cleveland Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. We're also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Student Fund. With us today are students from John Adams High School. Will the students please stand and be recognized? Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club questions and answers. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and City Club Special Initiatives Coordinator Philip Williams. First question, please.
How you doing, Ms. Wilkerson? Oh, hi. How you doing? You talked about the struggle of the people who had encountered far as coming from the south to the north. My question is two questions. When they got to the north, how did they migrate to certain neighborhoods within a particular city? Can you comment about that? And secondly, what was the role of the black church in those and in the north at the time?
Those are great questions. The reality in the north was that the north needed the labor, but was not quite certain about how to incorporate the actual people. Labor and workers are not the same thing. And so in all of in most of the receiving stations, meaning the cities that the people went, they were consigned to certain neighborhoods that are recognizable even to this day in many cities because they're often the oldest neighborhoods, the oldest black neighborhoods in any particular city. And those are the places that they were consigned to. They had challenges in the South, but then there were challenges in the North. In the South, there was obviously there were laws that reached the level of absurdity. I mean, having to do with there actually was, believe it or not, there was segregation at all levels of education in the South, and it went as far as to having segregated schools for the blind. Even though they couldn't see one another. So they went through. There was an absurdity almost to the level of the segregation in the South, but in the North there was a kind of rigidity that they had not. That was invisible rigidity, and they ran into what were known as restrictive covenants, which literally meant that whites who might have even wanted to sell to blacks were literally prevented from doing so, even if they had the inclination to do so. And so they ran into many limits, and so it's very well known that there were places that they could move and places they could not upon arrival. Those neighborhoods often ended up being the ones that became the red light district, not because the people themselves were necessarily out doing the kinds of things that occur in the red light district. These were often people who were straight from the farm, and a lot of them lost their paychecks on the way back from the factory the first couple times because they fell prey to the the machinations of what happens in a big city. They just weren't really prepared, you might say. So that was one of the things is there were many limits that they faced when it came to finding housing. They often, interestingly enough, paid more for the dilapidated housing that they had inherited from the previous wave of immigrants because they were constricted, so constricted that it meant that, simple economics of supply and demand meant because the supply was so limited and the demand was so high that the landlords could extract the most money from the people who had the least pay and who were living in the worst circumstances. And that was the world that they came to when they first arrived. And yet, like any immigrant group, they had to survive. Failure is not an option, and they made do with what they had. And that it's in that context that I seek to really try to understand what it was like for them, what it was like for the forebears of so many people, as the Owens would have been. When it comes to the second question that you had was about the black church. And an interesting thing about the black church is that the churches north and south, in fact, played a role. I mean, church, particularly in the South, at the time of the migration, was in some ways one of the few activities that they often could engage in because, first of all, their pay was so meager, if and when they were paid, that often all that they really could afford to do was the kind of the worshipful acts of church going. And so when they left, many of them were leaving their ministers against their ministers' wishes. So that's one way of looking at the effect of the church. Actually, many of the people left against the wishes of the pastor. The pastors often followed their flock north. So the church kind of migrated with the people, which is another interesting way of looking at leadership. I mean, it gives you a kind of inspiration to realize that it was, in this case, it was within the hearts of the individuals that seemed to know what was best for them. Now, in the North, many of the great churches in the big cities of the North ended up benefiting greatly, and many of them owe their very membership to the fact that many of the mega churches became mega churches. Some of the first mega churches in the country were the black churches that were overflowing with people from the South who needed to find a home church in the North. And some of them had membership of 5,000 long before we heard about the mega churches of today, and many of them benefited from it. In fact, there was almost a competition among some of them. There would be signs out there saying, "We welcome newcomers," and everybody knew who the newcomers were. I mean, in Cleveland, there would be people from Alabama. I mean, that's what it was. So there was a great interconnectedness between the migration and the churches as we know them, North and South.
So thank you, Ms. Wilkerson, for coming to Cleveland, and thank you for writing this beautiful book that shows that there was a strategic, that people didn't just come like Beverly Hillbillies and just show up. But my question is, so many, but one is, what happened to the cities that we left behind? How do you, secondly, do you see this happening again in our history? And how does it compare for our young people, many of us who have children, who have decided that this city doesn't, or a city doesn't support them, and they are migrating to other places across the country? Is there any comparison to that?
Well, that's a great question, and I usually incorporate it in my talks, but I figured that it would very likely come up. There's a term that's being used for a now 40-year-old demographic reality, which is what's called the reverse migration. I tend to prefer not to call it the reverse migration, because if you think about putting your car in reverse, you're going backward. And I don't believe any migration is a backward movement, and that's because we all are products of some migration, and a migration is in some ways a wish and a prayer that things might be better for an individual or their family someplace else. And I believe in the power and the importance of that ability to make that decision, the freedom to make that decision. This return migration, as I like to call it, is in some ways one of the great legacies of the original Great Migration. It's because of the fact that these 6 million people left the South. made the great sacrifice to make a break out of places. Remember, many of them had never been outside of the county in which they had been born, never been outside of Chickasaw County, Mississippi, and they're land in a place like Chicago. I mean, it's like going to another planet, which is why it's called the warmth of other suns, you know. And so so that I believe that extreme break from one place to another, both psychologically, emotionally, geographically, economically, and politically, was a watershed moment that occurred at that time that helped lead to the ultimate freedoms that occurred as a result of the final break, which would have been the civil rights movement and thus the civil rights legislation of the 60s. In other words, it was all leading toward that freedom, a freedom which actually has helped to change the South and make it a more welcoming place for all people, not just African Americans who are the descendants of the migration and would like to return to the ancestral homeland, but also for Northern whites who have told me while I've been out talking about this that they would never have imagined themselves living in Charlotte or North Carolina or in Atlanta or parts of South Carolina. They would never have imagined themselves living in the South had the South been as it was before, with all the signs and the caste system as it was. And also there's a Latino migration to the South too. These are populations that had never been there before. So in some ways what these people did was, I think, a singular moment in time. It was not the same as one being transferred by your company from say Cleveland to Denver, or from Chicago to Atlanta. It does not have the same. It doesn't have the same freight and sense of sacrifice of a final break. Many of the people in this great migration never returned again. Absolutely never returned again. I ran into many people who never returned. I ran into many who maintained a connection. I interviewed over 1,200 people, as you may or may not know. And but there were some who never returned. The book is about 3 people who were part of this migration, and 3 amazing people who each represent one of the migration streams. And in one case, the husband of one of the characters, Ida Mae, only returned once, and that was for the funeral of the brother who had raised him, the older brother who had raised him, and he did not stay overnight. So that you can get a sense on the basis of that this was a kind of sacrifice and break that had a kind of magnitude that's beyond our comprehension, of a place where you could never want to stay overnight in a place. And that's why I view this return migration in some ways one of the great legacies of it. In other words, by their making the sacrifice, they made the South, they helped force the South to change and made it a more welcoming place for everyone, even if they themselves never had a chance to see it. I hope that helps answer your question.
I'm curious, apart from the factory jobs, was there something especially attractive about Cleveland that made it a especially welcoming place? Was it perhaps the tradition of tolerance in the Western Reserve, or its role in the Underground Railroad?
I think it was all. I think it's all those things. I think that going back to the Underground Railroad itself, the Ohio River alone. Remember, they had not seen these places. They had not actually seen them. This was something that was handed down through word of mouth as to safe places to go, and the names became legend. People even named their children after things in the North. Like there were 2 brothers, and one was named Sears and the other one Roebuck, for example. You know? So that in some ways they didn't know. They had heard, and they'd gotten word from someone who had been up north. It took one person to come back and report back that this was a good place for them to go. But the Ohio River, in my view, more than anything, represented that moment of passage from one place of indentured servitude and slavery and enslavement and oppression to one of freedom and being able to breathe free. There's a section there was a survey that was done of people who had migrated, happened to have been in Chicago, and they asked the people, why did you go? What is it up here that you wanted? And a lot of people have focused on the jobs, and of course it was the jobs that were the mechanism which allowed them to leave. But when they were asked over and over again, the word freedom came up over and over again. I wanted to be able to breathe free. This is a place where I can walk free. This is a place where you can be free and free to be yourself. This is a place where you don't have to worry about people making you step off the sidewalk. This is a place where I can walk and people maybe don't pay me any attention, and that's a great thing by itself. Freedom came up over and over and over again. And they often one of the things that happened, to get to one of the questions that you had asked about what happened in the cities that they left, the people had, for the most part, not left cities. They had left plantations, they had left farms, they had left countryside and small towns in the South primarily. In the South at the time of much of the 20th century, African Americans were not an urban people, North or South. They simply were not. That's one of the this is why it's hard to compare it to anything else that might ever happen, because the transition has been made. Now it's where do you go from here when it comes to the next step for any group of people, for our country, you might say, when it comes to incorporating the lessons that come from all of this. But ultimately, they were a country people, a rural and small town people, and they became an urban people. They clustered in the cities where they felt there would be more people like themselves, and they created clubs where they could maintain their connections, as with other groups. In many places there are Alabama clubs, and not just Alabama clubs, but the part of Alabama that you're from. There in Chicago, for example, there's a Greenwood, Mississippi club, Greenville, Mississippi club, and never to be confused. You know. There's a Brookhaven, Mississippi club, the Grenada, Mississippi club, the Newton, Mississippi club. And if you were at one of these clubs, if you belonged to one of the clubs, why would you go to the Newton, Mississippi club if you're from Grenada? I mean, you just wouldn't do it. I mean, they're not even that far apart, but you just would never go because that's not where you're from. And in Los Angeles, there are many clubs from on the West Coast. There are corresponding clubs representing the parts of Louisiana that the people might be from. And so that Cleveland and all of the cities that the people went to became symbols and receiving stations and reflections of their hopes and wishes and dreams of being able to be in a safe place together with people like themselves. And Cleveland being the big city here in Ohio would have been attractive to them because it was legendary.
First of all, I want to thank you for a profound and wonderful book.
Thank you.
My question, you had actually already answered it about people of today returning to the South. But my comment is, as you've crisscrossed the country, when I read this book, I got almost to the very end, and I saw my mother. I saw my mother. I never understood when people came from the South that we had to spend days cleaning and cooking and putting everything in order for these people who were just coming from South Carolina. No big deal. But I thank you for that. And I think a lot of people who will see their families in this book.
Thank you so much.
To piggyback on what the young lady said, I also saw, people in my family. One of the elements of the book that rang true to me was that it was a story about capitalism and about people looking for a better place. But one character in particular, George, I thought it was a fantastic story. And it was interesting how George was able to transcend class, but he was unable to transcend race. And in many cases, you talked about that when he went over to Europe and he had to ride in the back behind Nazis. My question for you is, what did it feel like when you said that you got in a car and you rode, I think it was from Louisiana to California,
yes,
during the same route that George rode? What did it feel like, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, you're speaking about Dr. Foster, and that was the drive that he had to take. He'd been a surgeon in the Army, where he'd been able to perform surgery, although he had many challenges to being able to do that. But he had been allowed to perform as a physician in the Army during the Korean conflict. But after the war, and he said he wanted to find a place for himself and his family, and it turned out he could not practice surgery in his own hometown of Monroe, Louisiana. And so he set out on a course from Monroe, Louisiana, which happened to have been also, interestingly enough, the home of two diametrically very different people. One was Huey Newton, was founder of the Black Panther Party, and also of Bill Russell, the NBA great, the legend, who both of them were, all of these people were part of the Great Migration. There's so many big names that it's mind-boggling how much of American history, 20th century, was the result of the decisions of the parents and grandparents to leave, thus creating an opportunity for people like Toni Morrison to become the great Nobel laureate that she would have become. She wouldn't have been able to even go into a library and take out a library book had her parents remained in Alabama at the time that she would have been growing up. They did not, of course. They went to Lorain, Ohio. But and then also such people as August Wilson, the playwright, and Richard Wright, the novelist, from whom his work inspired the title of this book. And so many people, of course, Jesse Owens and Jackie Robinson, and in music, Prince and Michael Jackson, and almost anyone you can think of in music, from Miles Davis and John Coltrane to Jay-Z. I mean, all of these people are products of the Great Migration. But to get to the question about the experience of actually driving, I wanted to recreate the journey because I wanted this to be something that a person could. This is called narrative nonfiction. You see that, you read that somewhere in some catalog it'll be called nonfiction, and somewhere else will be called history. But essentially, it is narrative nonfiction, which means that it has protagonists, as in a novel. And these are three real people, which is why it took 15 years to work on it, because I had to get information from them in order to recreate it so that you would feel like you wanted to read it. And I wanted you to be able to see yourselves in the individuals as they're on that train or in that car or out in that field or looking for a place to live in wherever they happen to have landed. And so for part of it, I needed to recreate the journey of this doctor, Robert Foster, who had migrated, who was in a Buick. He had a Buick Roadmaster. He said if you'd seen it, you would have wanted it too. And I had my parents in the car with me, who, as I have told you, were part of this Great Migration. And we were, I was driving because he, it turned out, had to drive the entire way. He did not have anyone else in the car with him, and he had misjudged the boundaries of what we now call Jim Crow. In other words, for much of the drive that any African American might have made at that time throughout much of the South, they knew they did not like it, they did not accept it, they were not happy in any way about it. It was a disheartening reality that they could not stop to rest at a hotel or a motel. They could not be assured of being able to get gas. They could not be assured of being able to get water. They could not be assured of being able to even get food. So they often packed everything with them, along with a copy of the Psalms, in order to make sure that they could get to their destination okay. But they felt that by the time they got to a certain point outside of the South, it would be safer to try to find a place to rest. And it turned out that he could not, even though he was driving from Louisiana to California, so that he had to drive through 3 states of the West without being able to stop. And he was, which is difficult enough as it was. You're going through hairpin curves, and you're going through the mountains, the desert at night with little sleep. His friends would say that was the least of the concerns. The main thing is he was just a terrible driver. So it's a wonder that he could have made it at all. But my goal was to try to recreate that so that anyone reading the book would know truly what he had gone through, what he had experienced, what it was like to be in a situation like that where you can't just stop where you might want. Remember, it's astonishing. I mean, there were no cell phones. I mean, we can't. I mean, how many of you have a cell phone on you now? You can't leave the house. You don't go grocery shopping. You don't walk the dog without having the cell phone on you. And, here he was driving the desert with nothing, no backup. And so the idea of all of this was to try to recreate it. I wanted to know what was it like to feel the grip of the wheel and the stress of all of that. And I recreated it. And at a certain point, my parents were worried because I was veering from the road from the lack of sleep for trying to recreate this. And they began to get worried for all of us, and they said, please stop the car. Please stop the car, and if you won't stop the car, let us out. And so we stopped the car and we found a place in Yuma, Arizona, because, of course, it was no longer 1953. And we've come such a long way as a country. We have a long way to go, but we've come so very far. And we had no trouble finding a place. But that actually made me feel even more empathy for him and for those people, the millions who had to endure what they did, because they didn't have that option. They didn't have that option. And for that, I feel such a sense of gratitude for what they endured.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to Isabel Wilkerson, author of The Warmth of Other Suns. Thank you, Ms. Wilkerson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.